Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Gray, the Director of Programming for the New York Times live conversation series TimesTalks, which pairs New York Times journalists with the brightest and boldest creative minds from the fields of film, fashion, theatre, music, art, literature, and social justice. I am so delighted and honored to welcome you to tonight's event with the New York Times journalist who blew open 3 of the biggest sexual harassment cases of the past year. Twohey, who co-authored the Harvey Weinstein investigative piece, Emily Steele, whose story on Bill O'Reilly led to the former Fox News host's firing, and Bennett, who wrote a harrowing report on the pervasive culture of sexual harassment in Silicon Valley. These women have profoundly changed the way that sexual harassment will be dealt with in the workforce moving forward, and have shown the world that when we have the courage to speak truth to power, women can change the world. Tonight, we're going to hear how they broke the stories, the aftermath, and what they believe will lead to lasting change. Our panelists will be in conversation with the Times' new gender editor and author of the best-selling book, Feminist Fight Club, Jessica Bennett. Please join me in giving an extra warm welcome to Jessica Bennett, Emily Steele, Bennett, and Twohey.
Thank you all for being here. It is an honor to be up here with these women. And, you know, I have joked that it is impossible to talk about what's happening without using a lot of bad natural disaster metaphors. Tsunami, hurricane, icebergs, floodgates opening. But it truly feels as if we are weathering a storm in some sense. And the dominoes continue to fall. You know, there were new allegations today regarding Louis C.K., the British Parliament, Kevin Spacey. The names go on and on and on. But what we want to do here tonight, I think, is take a step back, because the reporting process has been incredibly rigorous and fascinating to hear a bit from behind the scenes. And one of the questions I keep coming back to in wondering myself how this went for each of you is, did you ever worry that the reporting would come at your own expense? You know, we saw the New Yorker piece earlier this week about ex-Mossad agents trailing reporters and digging up dirt on them. So Megan, let's start with you.
Sure. So my reporting on this issue doesn't start with Harvey Weinstein. It starts with Donald Trump and the 2016 presidential race. And in the spring of last year, in the spring of 2016, I co-wrote a story with my colleague Michael Barbaro, who many of you may listen to on The Daily, about looking at Trump's treatment of women. And at the time, there were people that we had talked to who had come forward, who we spoke to, and we published their voices in our story, who talked about uncomfortable encounters they had had, you know, him kissing them on their mouth in sort of professional settings, unwanted kissing, unwanted touching, you know, sort of sexual comments. And so we published a story in May of last year that sort of set off you know, was a controversial story. Right after the story ran, I got a lot of, you know, yes, I got some positive messages from readers, but I also got a lot of hate mail, people who said that they wanted to, you know, that basically saying, you know, that they wanted bad things to happen to me, that, you know, I could be raped and murdered and dumped in a river and it would suit me, right? And then months after that, the Access Hollywood tape was released, and there were women who sat at home and watched as he, you know, responded to the release of a tape in which he was caught bragging about groping women and engaging in other sexual misconduct and assaultive behavior. And there were women who were sitting at home and watched him deny that he had ever actually done any of those things, who stepped forward. And actually one of those women is here tonight, Jessica Leeds, who was somebody that I wrote about with Michael Barbaro in October of last year. She and another young woman were the first two people who came forward after the Access Hollywood tape to say, actually, I did have that such an encounter with him. In her case, she said that he had groped her on a plane. Many years ago, another young woman said that she had had an encounter with him in which he had kissed her on the mouth when she sort of had a chance encounter with him at Trump Tower. And that was a story in which I had to go to Trump and say, these are we're going to be publishing these allegations. Obviously, we would never report these allegations without sort of doing due diligence and coming to you and asking them about it. And he, when I got him on the phone, really lit into me. He started screaming at me. He called me a disgusting human being. And afterwards, and said, I'm going to sue you if you publish this story. And his lawyer did in fact send threatening letters to the New York Times, and he continued to call me a liar, call my other reporters who wrote on this liars, threatened to sue us, called the women who'd come forward liars and threatened to sue them. And so it was interesting. That was my first experience with this. What it meant to cover this issue and what the potential response would be. And we took, we were, not only the reporters, but the women themselves, while there was some support for the work and the stories and their voices, there were also, threats and, I felt pretty battered at certain points in time doing that coverage. And that was, and then I sort of entered the Weinstein picture a little later, and there were obviously other stories that came in between.
And still going.
And still going.
Emily, I listened to the episode of you on The Daily where you talk about sitting across face to face with Bill O'Reilly. And he doesn't actually yell on the tape in that interview, but he in fact threatened you a number of years prior. Can you tell us about that?
Right, so what happened was in 2015, there had been this big controversy in the beginning of the year with regards to Brian Williams and whether or not he had fabricated stories and whether he should be continue to host the nightly news on NBC. And in the aftermath of that reporting, Mother Jones did a report on Bill O'Reilly that basically said that he had fabricated claims that he had reported from a war zone or earlier in his career. And so we were doing a pretty straightforward story on this controversy. I had called Fox News for comment. We wanted to make sure that the story was fair and accurate and give them a chance to comment. And he called me, and I answered the phone, and I said, "Hi, this is Emily." And right away, I'm like ready to type so that I can have the conversation ready to report on. He says, everything that you've done so far has been fair, but if you do anything that I find untoward, I'll come after you with everything that I have. You can take that as a threat. So I just kind of typed up the notes, and then I said, okay, can I ask you some questions? And then I said, okay, so how are you going to respond to this controversy, blah, blah. And then I hung up the phone, and then I was a little rattled, and I told my editors, I was like, he just threatened me, and then we decided, it was on the record, and we decided to put it in the story, and we tweeted it. And it's really interesting, because that was in February of 2015, so it was about a year and a half before any of the controversy, any of the sexual harassment issues at Fox News had burst into public view. But when Mike Schmidt and I, the journalist who I did all the O'Reilly reporting with, when we kind of got onto the O'Reilly reporting in August of 2016, it's kind of always in the back of my head. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't anything related to that reporting, but it did help me understand what some of the women who said that he had threatened them or who made allegations against him, what they might have experienced and what that behavior might have been like for them.
What was it like when you actually sat across from him?
It was, so the minute that Mike and I learned that we were going to interview O'Reilly, I was really anxious and nervous. I actually saw Megan in the morning in the cafeteria, and she's like, "Hey, how are you? What's going on?" And I was like, "I can't talk. I'm on deadline. I'm really nervous."
She looks like...
And people are like, "You're already fair." I was so white that day. I was really nervous. And Mike was very, he was like, this is just going to be a conversation. We're going to be able to sit down like adults. Why else would he meet with us? So we walked across on 40th Street to the lawyer's office. The whole time I'm like really, really nervous. And then we sit down, and he barely shakes our hands. And during the whole interview, he sits right across from us, and he kind of is like leaning back in the chair, and he has his hands clasped on his stomach like this, and he's just looking straight. And he only looks at Mike during the interview. He doesn't really ever look at me until the end, when he kind of exploded and yelled at us.
Just a conversation.
Yeah.
No big deal.
Yeah.
Everyday
He also
life
didn't really
of a New York
answer
Times
any other
reporter.
questions. Yeah.
Katie, what about you?
So I've been in positions before where people I've written about have threatened to sue the publication, or threatened to attack me, or threatened to attack my editors, and so I was braced for that. But what I didn't expect was that one of the investors that I wrote about, he actually really tried to sort of soft pedal me on the idea that he had been a great source to other journalists, including my own colleagues, and that he would love to continue to do that. But he just didn't know, and maybe he could be a great source to me too, but he had definitely already done that with other people I worked with, and that spigot could get turned off. So I actually I was never prepared for somebody to indirectly threaten my colleagues and their ability to do their job. So that actually really rattled me. And I immediately called my editor, Twohey, Tam, who is awesome. And I explained to her what had happened. She kind of paused, and she goes, "Well, I think you should just get back on the phone and call him back and say we don't bow to threats." I was like, "What?" And she goes, "Yeah, just give him a call." She goes, "You just reach out to the other reporter first and let him know what happened, and just so he has a heads up." But she was like, "We don't bow to threats. That's all you have to say, and then you can just get off the phone." I was like, "Okay, sure." It sounds very easy when she says it, so I rehearsed it. But what was so interesting about that is that she was totally not rattled, and I think that one of the great things about our coverage, because between Biz Day, where Emily and I are, and the investigations team, there's so many female editors up those reporting chains. So Rebecca Corbett is on the investigations team. My editor, Twohey Tam, is a woman. She reports up to 2 more women up to the masthead, where Rebecca Blumenstein is on the masthead. So it made some of those conversations a little bit easier, even though sometimes they were intimidating, for me anyway.
So most of the editors on my story were all men, but they also were very supportive and very encouraging, and also didn't bow to threats either. So I don't think it really matters if you're a woman.
No, it was just sort of nice to see that many women on the masthead.
But in terms of threats and tactics, to sort of circle back then to the Weinstein story that I reported over the course of the summer with Jodi Kantor, we knew, there were a variety of tactics that we suspected he was using to try to stop the story. But you can be sure that we didn't know, the story that came out this week that revealed that he had hired a private investigative firm that wasn't just digging up dirt on female accusers, but also trailing reporters, trailing my colleague Jodi Kantor, and working up a file on her. I've never encountered that.
And to see her named in the piece.
Right.
What was your process like? I read in Marie Claire, you began on this piece the day after you got back from maternity leave?
Correct, yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Tell us how, you have a young daughter.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. When I was doing the coverage of Trump, including, allegations of sexual misconduct against him, and he was screaming at me on the phone and calling me a disgusting human being, I was about 8 months pregnant. Mm-hmm. And so I finished out the election and then went on maternity leave, and and it was interesting because I was home sort of with a screaming baby, trying to kind of keep my head above water. And I remember watching, and I'd sort of kind of desperately turned to the news on TV and my old life as a reporter. And so I saw the OReilly story, and I didn't know Emily, but I was, to see the massive impact of that story was pretty exciting to watch from the living room of my home in Brooklyn with the screaming baby. But so when so about 3 months in, I got a call from Jodi Kantor, who said, Megan, I'm starting to, the paper's really committed to, moving forward with sexual harassment coverage, and I'm starting to look into Harvey Weinstein. And, the editor, Rebecca, had suggested that, I reach out to you to figure out how we might, if you have any suggestions on how to reach out to women and see if they might talk to us and ultimately go on the record. And so I sort of, once again, with baby on hip, was saying, okay, absolutely. Well, I'm so glad that you're, that you're taking up this story, and that's really exciting. And listen, all I can tell you is that in my experience in reaching out to women and on these very sensitive subjects, when you're kind of knocking on the doors of women who have had bad experiences, sometimes, oftentimes they've been violated not just by the individual, but then by an institution. If they turn to the police or their place of work for help, oftentimes they've been sort of violated again by the failure of these institutions to act and protect them. And so what I said to her, and this is something that we ended up employing as we moved forward, was, I've had a good experience when you're talking to these women, many times, like, what's the incentive for them to participate in the story? And what you're saying, I said, listen, what I've found can be useful, and I mean it, is when I say it, is listen, we can't change what's happened to you, but we can, if you work with me, we may be able to prevent this from happening to other women, and especially with people, and it's not surprising in all of the coverage that we've done. These are often not isolated incidents. In the case of Weinstein, you're looking at sort of 22-year-olds who had encounters with him in 1990, and you're looking at 22-year-olds who worked for him in 2015 and had encounters that, in some cases led to settlements. And so that was how Jodi and I sort of first started talking. And then when I came back from maternity leave, it just was a no-brainer that I wanted to link up with her. And it was, we worked basically around the clock in a close partnership, working to track down. In the case of Weinstein, it was not just tracking down women who had been employees in the company, but in some cases now very famous actresses who had had experiences. Sometimes it was in recent years, sometimes it was decades ago, and we were not culture reporters. We weren't Hollywood reporters. We were like investigative reporters who had never kind of covered that world, and so it was. It required a variety of skill sets that we had to. Some of them was just old-fashioned, investigative reporting, knocking on people's doors. But I think in the case of Weinstein, there was also, how do you reach out to, and Jodi did a lot more of the actresses, but how do you basically, you're not going to go up and knock on Angelina Jolie's door. So how do you kind of get around agents and managers and what we now understand to maybe be a whole system that was working to kind of keep this quiet?
How many slammed doors in your face for every woman who talked to you? I would say, well, there were, it's not just the women who you're reaching out to. You're reaching out to, men who worked at the company and other people who could provide insight, who knew what was going on, who were part of settlements. And I would say that sort of all combined, I'd say we had a batting average of maybe 10, sort of 10 strikes before you got hit a single or a double. Katie and Emily, how did you gain your sources' trust?
Well, part of it was Emily's story. So her story published in April, and it was this amazing story about Bill O'Reilly, somebody who people thought was totally infallible, and not infallible, but unassailable. Mm-hmm. And so I actually used that story to show people how committed we were to the reporting. that was really helpful. And then one woman who eventually went on the record but didn't at first, she had really smart feedback. She said, Katie, I don't want to be part of another one of these stories where women talk about something bad that happened to them and everybody ostracizes them and thinks that they're horrible people and nothing happens. She was like, so that's why I don't want to go on the record. So I actually ended up using her a lot to like help me plan. And she became an amazing ally and also just somebody who really helped me think these stories out. She also had a very broad network of women in Silicon Valley who she could tap and then introduce me to once she and I had formed a strong relationship. So we were like, okay, well, what is the point of this story? So in one story, I thought, well, maybe the point is just to show how systemic it is so people do take it seriously. So that's how we attacked that story. And then another story that I did about the use of NDAs to silence people and how legal contracts are used to keep people from talking. I thought, well, maybe we just specifically look at this one issue. And she was helpful there because she said, I know people who've signed these contracts. I'm going to see if one can help you out. And now we have like some people in Congress who are thinking about making those illegal, which is great. And then the last story that I did with my friend Nathaniel Popper was, okay, well, what about these like the actual companies themselves, not the investors, not the entrepreneurs, but the big multi-billion-dollar startups. There was one where we saw that the board had been totally neglectful, so we thought, okay, so the point of this story is to show board neglect and how these things are perpetuated within a company by the investors and by the board. So there was always a purpose, and because I looked at each story as like, what's the purpose, what's the point? This woman was so amazing and willing to help me find the people I needed in her network to help me. And that was,
shepherd, kind of.
It was extraordinary. I've never experienced anything like it.
It's amazing.
Yeah, she's great.
I think for us, as we started this reporting, it was in August. So it was a month after all of the controversy at Fox News had really burst into public view. And we started by just looking at this one case. It was Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, idea to look at this one case from 2004 where this young producer on Bill O'Reilly's show sued him for sexual harassment. And it was this big public case. It was all over the tabloids, all over cable news, and then it settled. She disappeared. You never heard from her again. And so we just made a list. We went through the lawsuit. We made a list of who was the friend that she had dinner with? Who did she go to college with? Who did she work with at the time? Who was on his staff over this 2-decade-long career? And we just started dialing for dollars. And Mike and I would sit in this little conference room, and we had this crazy map, like a very Homeland style, on a whiteboard wall, just of like, who is this person? What is their interest? We would look up so much information about everybody, like see how they would conduct themselves on video interviews, look up who their mom was, who their friends were, who they went to high school with, and just kept calling and calling and calling and calling and calling. And then when we would call, we really just tried to listen. Mike would always be like, stop talking, because I will interrupt people sometimes. And we'd really just try to listen, because for a lot of the sources that we talked to, they had never really talked about this issue before, and they hadn't ever really talked with anybody besides a lawyer or a therapist about this. And so it was a really different experience for them to talk to a reporter who just wanted to listen, who just wanted to see what happened. And we were just trying to follow the facts. And then the other thing that we would do too is we started to figure out that maybe there had been this pattern where Bill O'Reilly would kind of meet young women and kind of develop this relationship with them, and then give them career advice or offer to give them a special slot on his show, and then he would target them with unwanted sexual advances or other inappropriate behavior, is what they said. And so then we pulled up this list from IMDb, the movie database, of all of the women who had been on his show, and we just went through and contacted every single one. And we got a lot of people who would send the messages on to O'Reilly, and they knew everything that we were looking into. But then there was this one woman who called me back, and her name is Wendy Walsh, and she was this relationship expert who would appear on his show every Thursday night. And then all of a sudden, she stopped appearing. And we had seen some of these videos, and so we called her and had no idea what had happened. She said, oh yeah, there was this one weird thing where we had dinner, and then he asked me up to his hotel room, and I said no, and then the appearances ended. Wow. And then I said, is great. Like, well, can you tell me more? Like, do you have documents? Are there emails? Will you go on the record? And she said, no, I don't want to talk about this on the record. This is just something that happened. I've moved on. It's fine. And then Mike was like, call her back, call her back, call her back. So I kept calling. And then finally I was like, okay, I'm going to be in LA where she lives. Will you see me? And she said, oh, I'm really busy. I have a Pilates class that morning. And then I said, oh, I really love Pilates too. Where's the studio? And so we did Pilates together, and then it was very hard, and I was like quivering on this board. And then afterwards, we got breakfast, and she decided, I'll go on the record. And the interesting thing that I hadn't really thought about before until Megan and I started talking, it was right after the Access Hollywood tape had become public. Mm-hmm. And what she had told me is that, it's really important that we continue to talk about this issue. And these other women have gone on the record, these other women have talked about it, and we need to keep talking. We need to keep talking about this.
Yeah, the voices have been so helpful. I mean, with each story, all of us get emails from potential sources or people who want to talk about their story. It's been incredible, and I think that's been one of the really positive things about this.
Because I think a lot of women never really talked about this. They wouldn't share it with their friends or their coworkers because maybe they felt ashamed, like it was their fault. They wouldn't report it to HR. They wouldn't hire a lawyer. And so now that they're seeing that there's all of these stories and all of these women are talking, that they're not alone, and it makes it less about them and more about the systemic problem.
Right, which I think transitions well into what do you think has allowed the floodgates, so to speak, to open? Like, we have seen cases like this in the past. We saw what happened after Anita Hill. After Anita Hill, in 1991, complaints to the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission went up by 73%. And then it sort of died down. And then we saw Cosby, but then we stopped talking again. And now we have not stopped talking about this for weeks and weeks and weeks. What do you think is different? How much of this does have to do with Access Hollywood?
Well, I think I see those things on this really long continuum. So I think Anita Hill is part of what we see today. We have today because of Anita Hill. And then we have today because of someone like Ellen Powell, who fought Kleiner Perkins, this huge venture capital firm. She lost, and she lost big, and it was horrible, but we have what we have today because of her. We have what we have today because of that 2004 lawsuit where everything disappeared. So I think that's part of it. It's been a long, slow burn. And then I think that we've seen a lot of progressive issues build steam since Trump was elected. Not just this issue, but a lot of progressive issues. And I think especially in some of the reporting I've done, Silicon Valley is a liberal place, it's a progressive place. Everybody supports women and minorities there, supposedly. And so I think that they were often willing to overlook the bad actor who was outwardly progressive. They were willing to overlook somebody who everybody knew was a little bit shady, or everybody knew had been serially sexually harassing women, because he was so liberal, because he supported liberal causes, because he hosted dinners with politicians, and they thought, well, this greater good is happening, so I'm going to be quiet. But the greater good's not happening anymore in their minds. If for progressives, the greater good's not happening. So for them, they felt like, okay, well, I can't get Trump out of the White House, but I hope to get this guy, have this guy not be the CEO of my company anymore.
Yeah, and I think that, in just sort of speaking as reporters and, being able to piece together what it was that inspired individual women to finally speak up in the stories that we've reported over the past year, you can start to see that there was, even in the process of reporting one story after another and being relentless kind of in the pursuit of these stories and the determination to share these women's voices, that it continued to build, and you started to see results. I think that the OReilly, when OReilly fell, it was heard, across the country, and then and maybe there was a sense that maybe it was just limited to this particular news organization that might have a particular type of culture. Well, what did it mean then when we came back with, with Harvey Weinstein, who was also this sort of liberal lion? I think it showed two things. One, that the New York Times was committed to doing sort of dogged investigative reporting, on people both on the left and the right. But you started to see that this was a problem that was pervasive, that it went into, it was not just, it wasn't limited to one industry, it wasn't limited to people of a particular political stripe. And I think that was also something that happened. And in the case of Weinstein, I mean, a lot of the women who we had written about before had not been, they're necessarily household names. I mean, some people, some of the women that you've written about, people may have seen on Fox, but I think that there was an element that with the Weinstein story, everybody has seen one of these actresses who stepped forward. Everybody's seen a Weinstein movie. There was I think inevitably sort of a personal connection that in some ways resonated in a way that it hadn't before, when you kind of had these sort of more sort of faceless women. And I think that, you just can't sort of ignore that there was something slightly different with how familiar these women were to American households.
One of the other things that I've been thinking a lot about too is the original case with OReilly that was very public in 2004. We went back and we looked at all of the coverage of that story, and it was very interesting because I think it's very different than what we would see today if similar allegations were to be made. Mm-hmm. Because the initial wave of stories was about the lawsuit and the allegations that she had made against him. But then after that, we knew that the O'Reilly camp had hired private investigators and a public relations firm to feed information to the tabloids to depict her as a promiscuous woman who was trying to shake him down. And the tabloids kind of ate that up, and cable news really ate that up. And I think today, especially with the generation of women in newsrooms, would look at that story and say, what are we doing? Why are we covering this way? And I think that shift of perspective with a new generation of journalists, when there are a lot more women in the newsroom, really makes a difference.
Just kind of a literacy.
And with every single story, I mean, just to hear you talk about the tactics, the use of private detectives, the smearing of victims, the planting of stories in tabloids. Obviously, we've seen that with Weinstein as well. And I think what happened during the course of all these stories is that it wasn't just a single predator who was coming into view, or several predators who was coming into view. It was very similar patterns of behavior that had been used in the workplace with a whole system that supported that and silenced women. And I think once you started to piece together that this wasn't just a story about a single individual, it wasn't just about Harvey Weinstein, it wasn't just about Bill O'Reilly, it wasn't just about these figures in Silicon Valley, but rather about these patterns of behavior, predatory behavior that happen across the country in all these different workplaces. And oh my goodness, if maybe we're now at a moment where if you speak out, there can be consequences.
And the thing that was really extraordinary too about O'Reilly and Weinstein and the Silicon Valley stuff, it's not just that this behavior happened, but it's also that the company knew.
Yeah.
So when Fox renewed O'Reilly's contract in February of this past year, they knew that there had been 6 settlements over allegations of harassment against him. And what we know is those settlements have totaled about $45 million. And the company says that they didn't know the total amount of the payments, but they knew that there were that many allegations and that many settlements.
And I think that's where we see not just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
But we're not seeing just the patterns of behavior being repeated. We're seeing how huge systems are built to protect people in power, men and women. That's the other thing. I get a lot of incoming emails right now from men who are saying they've been harassed by other men, by women. So this is really a power story. That the systems are in place to protect the people in power. And so whether it is a large company, no matter, what it showed me is how much of our lives are reputation-based, and I never really thought of it that way. I never thought of business as a reputational act, but it really is. So Harvey Weinstein had a reputation to protect so he could have access to all these things. If you're an investor in Silicon Valley, if you're a venture capitalist like a Dave McClure, it's great, you need a good reputation because the actual results of your investment don't happen for a decade. And so that whole time you're preserving reputation to get the best investments. If you're in a newsroom, unless you're breaking hard news every day, you're a presenter, you need a public face, and that's reputation. We are a reputation-based society. So whose reputations matter the most? And it hit home for me when I spoke with an attorney who had worked on some of the Fox cases who said, listen, right now the system is set up to protect men's ability to make money over a woman's right to live her life and have a job. That's the power difference, and that's the system. That's what you're fighting, and that's what you're trying to uncover. And so I think that's what you see in addition to the patterns of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Silicon Valley is interesting because in many cases, these are VCs harassing founders. And so they're not technically in the same workplace. So
Right,
there
they're
isn't
not
really
employers.
recourse. You can't go to HR. You actually, I don't think, can file a complaint with the EEOC. There's a loophole.
Right.
So what are your sources telling you now? I mean, do people feel like there is change happening? Is the public shame element of being exposed
So
enough?
the shame element's strong because of the reputational risk, but at the same time, it depends on what your capacity and appetite for feeling shame is, so it's only so effective. But there's definitely been a shift. So that's almost the most pure form of combination of like capitalism, power, and abuse, because these are people saying, I need your money, and somebody's saying, I will give it to you in exchange for doing something you don't want to do. I mean, that is very, very clear. That is changing. The reputation thing has been a problem, and I think the industry wants to professionalize. They want to be a respected industry. They're small relative to most other financial services industries. Venture capital is very tiny, but they feel like they build these big companies. They're the reason why Google exists, why Facebook exists, why Amazon and Starbucks, these were all venture-backed companies. They want the credit for it, and they want to be known for it. They don't want to be known for this stuff. So they are trying to figure out, should we create a guild? Should we have more legal services for people? Should we have more blind hotlines that people can talk to somebody about, some sort of lawyer? Because clearly there's a need for that. And there's no HR department intervening in these interactions.
What kind of response are you getting now? Letters, hate mail, tweets, the usual. But what are people saying? Are there many people coming forward with different allegations? And how do you determine what to look into?
I think for me, it's a flood of, this happened to me and I just wanted to tell somebody. And you don't have to do anything about it, but just know that this happened to me. And I'm so glad you wrote those stories because I felt all alone, or I felt really ashamed, or I felt really stupid. Like, obviously I shouldn't have had that drink, and now look what happened to me because I'm so dumb and I don't feel that way anymore. So those are probably about half of the letters I get, and then a lot of them are leads for other stories. And then just some like positive feedback on the New York Times, which has been really great to see.
Yeah, the same. I've gotten a lot of handwritten cards, which are really sweet, and I've kind of tacked them onto my cubicle wall.
Yeah.
Which is nice. Because you don't always, like,
Yeah, usually
we're so focused on writing our stories and getting them in the paper. You sometimes forget kind of that bigger impact, and it's really amazing.
Yeah, I have one tacked up to my refrigerator at home that just felt really special to get handwritten things. But after the Weinstein story, our first story ran and on a Thursday, and he was fired on Sunday night, and then we just continued to have other stories for weeks after. We're still working on the story. And so it's been an interesting balancing act because we were continuing to cover this story as it unfolded, but we did, in the investigations unit where Jody and I work, started to receive, the day after the story ran, we just started to get, and especially after he got fired, there was just like a flood of emails and phone calls, and we were kind of, so how do you basically field this, avalanche of accusations that are coming through on the phone and by email against other, and there were people who were calling, who were messaging to say, thank you so much, and this happened to me, and I don't want anything reported, but, or maybe I had the courage to, to go back and confront a boss who did something to me years ago, and I didn't have the courage to do that then, but I have the courage now. Or, I've reported something to the police that I wasn't, I never intended to report. But there were also women who were calling in and saying, I basically want to go public with accusations against this particular figure in my industry or this particular person I worked for. And so we really kind of became this hotline, national hotline for very serious allegations, every single one of which we, took very seriously and wanted to, and we've just been kind of trying to do triage and how to make sure that we're, all those calls and all those allegations are finding a reporter on the other line that they can share, download what's happened, and that we can actually start the process of reporting on. But it's been pretty overwhelming.
Wow. How do you literally keep track? You had map set up Homeland style. Do you have a Google Doc?
We have a Google Doc. We have a Google Doc, yes, we do.
It's funny, it's not, it's sad, but it's...
No, we do. Yeah, there's spreadsheets, Google Docs. I mean, we're employing every strategy we can to try to...
tech forward here at the New York Times.
We're working on it. Yeah.
I use legal pads.
Legal pads.
I have stacks of legal pads, I'm obvious.
Silicon Valley reporter uses legal pads.
Yeah. But if there's anybody in the audience who has emailed us or called us and we haven't gotten back to you yet, please know that you're on the Google Doc, you're in the spreadsheet. I promise we'll get back to you. It may be at 10 o'clock at night. There are women where I say, who messaged me 2 weeks ago that I got back to, yesterday morning. But we will get back to you. You have our word.
Has it gotten easier to get people to go on the record since you have been reporting these stories? Do you think that there has been a precedent set that this has been taken seriously and we're going to continue investigating?
I know I'm working on another story right now, and I'm working to get a number of women to go on the record, and in part because of the O'Reilly stuff, because of the Silicon Valley stuff, and then really because of the Weinstein stuff, and seeing Angelina Jolie and seeing Gwyneth Paltrow, people are saying, it's going to be okay. I want to do this. And also, I'm not alone. So it has become a little easier, but it's not easy still. And there's still a lot of work and 3-hour phone calls and lots of time and energy.
And what was the process like in terms of corroboration? Did you need to have a certain number on the record before we went to print?
So with the O'Reilly story, the original one that we published in April, we found that there had been 5 settlements, and to confirm those settlements, we had multiple sources, we had viewed documents, and our other reporting supported that. And then in addition, we had one woman who was on the record in that story. And our editors really pushed for the documents, for the settlements, and for people to go on the record. So there were no unnamed allegations in our original story.
Yeah, I think that there's now with this flood of new allegations coming forward, I think that there could be a misimpression that a place like the New York Times would just turn around and report allegations without doing additional reporting, and that's not the case. These stories take a lot of work, even when women do agree to go on the record. I mean, there's 2 different sort of methods that you're employing. If there's been a settlement, you're trying to figure out how to get access to the records. In some cases, we've been able to report on things that have happened, and the women never go on the record. You're just basically trying to get your hands on settlement records or confirm that they've happened, and which is, we've talked about this kind of reverse engineering these settlements that had been, in these sort of payoffs that had been used to silence women, become a trail of evidence when you're a reporter going back and trying to track what somebody's done over the course of years or decades. And and if you report those, you don't even have to have the voice of the woman. She doesn't have to go out on a limb. In fact, oftentimes she can't. She's scared. She's scared that there could be legal damages against her if she does. And then in other cases, when women do agree to go on the record, when they had, there was never a police report, there wasn't a settlement, she sort of suffered this experience by herself it never came to the attention of an institution or the legal authorities. In that case, there's other due diligence you have to do to try before you give that person a voice in a story. You're saying, and Jessica Leeds, who's in the audience tonight, as I mentioned, one of the women who accused Trump, I mean, she could speak to this. We go to those women and we say, listen, is there anybody you told at the time that this happened? Well, if that's the case, can we call, so you said you called your mom, can we call your mom and talk about that and get corroboration that way? So it's rarely, I don't think you'll ever see in the New York Times or, probably in any other publication, just a woman, just her allegations without any other reporting that went around that. And it's a really rigorous process with a lot of hurdles. I mean, there was, we worked on the Weinstein story for months, and there was one time that Jody and I went out to dinner with our really tough, very talented editor, and she said, what do you got, kids? And we were like, well, we think we know of 20 incidents going back over the years. And she said, are any of these people on the record? Do you have any records at this point to substantiate this? And we said, no, I mean, we've heard that these, we've documented these, but we don't have that. And she said, well, you don't have a story. You've got to keep going and keep going and keep going until you get that. And in terms of the settlements, I think that is something that's changed in just the last month. I mean, there was a woman that I spoke to who had a settlement with Harvey Weinstein in 2004. She had an encounter with him in a hotel room. She says that he invited her into a hotel to talk about her, her career, and that he then proceeded to sexually assault her. And she went to, within days, she had sought the help of an attorney and was sitting across the table from Weinstein and his high-powered attorney at the time, and they were trying to figure out how are they going to move forward. And as she tells it, Harvey's attorney said to her, if you go public, we're going to drag you through the mud by your hair. And so she said, okay, I was too scared. I wasn't going to go up against these guys. I agreed to a settlement, and which involved basically a legal pledge that she would never speak about what happened. And I'm on the phone with her 2 weeks ago, and she said, I'm ready to break. I want to break this settlement. I'm ready. She said, even if he sues me for $150,000, I don't care. This is too important. And I think so. You're seeing that. I mean, that is from a reporter standpoint is something that's different from even a month ago. That you have that the women who felt like they were locked in silence by these legal settlements feel like they can speak out and not necessarily suffer the legal consequences. I mean, if Harvey Weinstein kind of takes this moment to go out, try to sue women who are speaking out, it'll be an interesting public relations move. I think he's worried now, but
it's interesting that you're saying about the settlements too, because the O'Reilly settlements have actually been really unusual in their size. 7 million, 3 million, 32 million. These are what I found is often these settlements, people's silence have been bought for a pittance for the cost of someone's therapy bills. That's actually a really common way to figure out how much money to give somebody in the negotiation, if you can call it that, because you have high-powered corporate attorneys on one side and then a single individual and their lawyer on the other. But oftentimes they'll say things like, well, I understood that really rattled you, so how much was your therapy for the year for that? Okay, well, that's $10,000, and we'll add it up. And I don't know, does $20,000 sound good to you for a lifetime of silence to never speak about this thing that happened to you? And people are saying yes to that. So to Megan's point, I think people are now thinking to themselves, screw it. I don't care if he comes after me for the $10,000 that I get, what's going to happen, because they're signing away their ability to speak for not very much money.
We're going to go to questions, and there's a complicated process for this that involves, you don't have to do anything. You stay in your seat, but there are microphones that will come to you. So raise your hand, a microphone will come, and instead of having awkward silences while that happens, we're going to take some questions from, I think, Facebook. And just as a reminder, because we only have 19 minutes and 11 seconds, questions end in a question mark.
The story about you doing Pilates, that was amazing. I've been a journalist a long time. Congratulations on that. Awesome idea. But as you alluded to, these 3-hour conversations, these are really difficult conversations. Getting these details out from these women. Can you guys talk about how you do that and the delicate work of, eliciting the details?
My approach is a very soft and gentle approach typically. I'll just call people and then I'll say, I'm reporting about the experiences of women at Fox News. I know that you were there. My name's Emily Steele. I'm a reporter at the time. Just a very kind of soft intro, and then I'll say, how did you start working there? Why did you start working there? What did you do? What did you like? What did you not like? Who are you friends with? And then just start building a relationship, because you can't just pick up the phone call and say, hey, I heard you were harassed. What was that like?
Absolutely.
Nobody's going to tell you that right away. So my editors thought I was crazy, I think, because I'd be in these conference rooms and be on the phone for so long. But you have to do that to get people to feel comfortable so that they'll tell you things.
Absolutely. And yeah, I would always say, we're only going to talk about as much as you feel comfortable talking about. So call me back later, or we can end this conversation whenever you want, because I wanted them always to not just feel in control of the conversation, but be in control of what they what their comfort level was. I mean, these are people who've already been pushed beyond their comfort level in so many ways. I just didn't feel like I could do that to them.
And especially, I mean, people who don't have experience with, I mean, in many cases, don't have experience with reporters and don't have experience with the press. So I always stress in my first conversations, like, this is a process. I'm not gonna hang up the phone and disappear on you and then you're gonna appear in a story. You know, I'd like to just have us start talking, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to text me or call me. There shouldn't be any mystery here on what I'm doing. And we're gonna take this one step at a time, and you're gonna have a voice and say in what happens every single step of the way.
Yeah.
And so why don't, you know, is there anything that you want to, you know, just, we can even just talk, let's talk off the record. Just, you know, just tell, you know, if you, please, I promise I won't even tell my colleagues, I won't tell my editor, you know, like, and just sort of one step at a time, making sure that people are comfortable and feel like they have agency in the process and that they have control.
Yeah, and I always really make sure to tell people too, like, you will never be surprised. Your name is never going to show up in the New York Times without you knowing every single thing that we're going to say about you, and you'll have a chance to comment on any of that, because we're not trying to surprise people.
And, or make things worse. I mean, in these cases, you know, I always say, like, listen, I am not showing up to make your life worse. You know, that's the last thing. I mean, we're coming at this issue because we care about it and we think that this reporting can make a difference and make a change and hold people responsible who haven't been held responsible in the past and accountable. But, you know, the last thing I want to do is, you know, a reporter who cares about this issue and cares about people who have suffered is to make your life worse, you know. So I give you my, you know, I give you my guarantee up front that that's not going to be, you know, I promise you that's not going to be the case. But it's a little tricky, you know. For example, like having done work with women who accused, you know, Trump of sexual misconduct, who then, you know, had him out, you know, on the campaign trail, like basically blasting them and threatening to sue them. I mean, I had conversations with Trump accusers who would say, "Listen, if he sues me, you know, what are you guys going to do about it?" You know, and that was, you know, so to then turn around and go back into the trenches on the Weinstein coverage and have these conversations with women where I was saying, you know, please come on this journey with me. I think we can make a difference. You know, I also had in the back of my mind that there are real consequences, and what are we as reporters going to be able to do, or as an institution be able to do when these people are out there, you know, sort of on a limb in a story.
I'm going to take Kristen from Facebook, who asks, how do you all hope your reports will change the future coverage of this topic?
I hope it changes behavior. I hope it changes what's normal in an office setting. And what's normal in an office setting has changed dramatically in a short period of time. So Mad Men's the early 60s, that's not long ago, that's no longer normal. You know, when I started in journalism, it was in the mid-2000s, and people who'd come before me in the magazine world, for them it was really normal for their editors to hit on them. It was really normal for, you know, that to be something that happens. You date somebody who might be your superior, no longer really normal. So I think we're seeing that line change for the better really quickly, and that's what I would hope for.
I think, like, the reason that we decided to do this reporting, it wasn't to take anybody down, but it was to hold people in positions of power accountable and also give a voice to those that need one. And so that's what I hope that we continue to do with this reporting. And I hope that it exposes this issue in a new way, and our society starts to understand how can women and men be treated equally in the workplace, so that sex isn't part of it, and people can just do their jobs.
It is noteworthy, I think, the difference in the way that we handle the language around it and the delicacy with which you all have handled this topic. And if you look back even 10 years ago at the coverage, you know, the language has changed, the language that they use, the quotes that people were giving, asking for, like all of these things that I think people would not be able to do now.
Hi. How do you think that the Roy Moore allegations will change this election versus the Billy Bush tapes?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
How do you think that the Roy Moore allegations will influence this election in comparison to the Billy Bush tapes? And, like, why or why not?
Right, yeah. Right. Well, that's a good question. I think that I'd have to see what the latest headlines are on that. But I thought that there had maybe been consequences already, substantial consequences already. But I'd have to check on that. Yeah.
Donna from Facebook. What advice do you have for the women who are not in Hollywood and don't have the visibility or power of those who've spoken up?
Yeah, so a lot of the people I've spoken to are like, a lot of women who worked at a company called SoFi. You might have taken a loan from them. It was such a problematic workplace. But yeah, you might want to just give them some breathing room there was some financial shenanigans there too. So, but I think for them, they were saying to themselves, a lot of these people who are hourly workers who are being paid anywhere between, I think, $12 and $17 an hour to work for this company. They were not, let's get super rich Silicon Valley people. They really were not. And so for them, they didn't have a lot of resources. They couldn't hire a high-priced lawyer. They weren't Angelina Jolie. And they were like, when this is all over, just know I'll never get another job again. And for me, I'm making no money already. So those were really difficult conversations. And I think in those situations, a lot happens, and this happened in this case, where the people involved start talking to one another. Because I think it's very rare in a workplace where somebody's being either harassed or bullied that they're the only person. And I think that finding the other people in the workplace or who've come before you who've experienced similar situations is extremely powerful, and deciding as a group how to handle that, whether it's because you want to go to the press or you want a legal case or you just want to talk to one another and have a really good supportive group of people who talk and warn other people who then go work with that colleague. Those are all really powerful options, but I think not being alone and finding ways to be with one another is extremely important.
I think one of the things that was interesting about the Weinstein coverage, in which there were women who had encounters with him who were sort of 22-year-old assistants in the office who went off to, who now are working, who basically sort of everyday women who passed through his company at one point in time and then went on and are, living sort of very normal lives, but had these experiences in which they felt powerless. Actually aren't extremely different from the Angelina Jolie's and Gwyneth Paltrow's and I think that was one of the interesting lessons. I think that there was an assumption that maybe because people are famous or celebrities that there are maybe a class of protected women who don't experience this, or if they do feel like they have the power to respond. And I thought what was striking was that there were women, that these women, even these celebrities, sort of had the same struggles as women who are working as secretaries. That there was, in terms of feeling powerless in the face of what happened to them in the moment, and then afterwards, and feeling like there was a whole system that silenced them and made them fearful of going on the record in 2017. It's pretty remarkable. I mean, it made me realize that I think that's what's happened in the course of this reporting, is that once again, it's not just one individual, it's not one industry, that there are patterns of predatory behavior that have affected women, in all different industries, at all different ages, from all different backgrounds. And it doesn't really matter. I mean, sometimes it matters how much money they have, and sometimes it matters whether they're famous, but oftentimes it doesn't. And what are we going to do about that?
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Are there levels of severity of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct that you would filter through that you might not report that may take away from your story? Like if someone says, I walked past this person in the hallway and they looked at me and made me feel uncomfortable, is that something that might detract from the story, or do you report on every single incident?
So I think, so when I wrote a story about what's going on in Silicon Valley between investors and the women who were trying to pitch their companies to them and get money, one of the interesting things is there was a really broad scale of behavior that was happening that was keeping women silent and making them feel like they couldn't be entrepreneurs. First of all, at least for me, I would never be able to report on everything that came into my inbox and voicemail. It just, there aren't enough issues of the New York Times to actually, from now for the rest of my career, to put every allegation in. So a lot will be lost. So that's why I was approaching things thematically in some ways, especially in that story. Like, okay, what do we want to show? We want to show pervasiveness. We want to show the full spectrum of behavior. We want to talk about the impact of all sorts of different kinds of acts. So we got a lot of different incidents into that one story, and that's what made it really powerful. Whereas for a company-specific story with SoFi, it was more like, okay, well, what actually happened? There was a settlement. There was sexual misconduct. There was, a CEO who would invite people over to his house and then brag about other employees he'd slept with who weren't in the room. I mean, it was just sort of an overall portrait of an imperial CEO, and so that's what we wanted to go for. So it's never a matter of filtering out allegations because they're not severe enough or not salacious enough. It's more like, well, if the story is about a single person and their sort of imperial hold over a company, what are the incidents that are most impactful and that will best tell that story? Because so much hits the cutting room floor and not just the allegations. Lots of things hit the cutting room floor in a story. Unfortunately for my editor, I often hand in drafts that are a little long, and then they must be brutally trimmed. So that's definitely something that happens.
Yeah. This one over here. While that microphone is coming. This is a good question from Melinda on Facebook. Do you think part of the solution to this pervasive problem is to replace the predators with female staff and board members? And interestingly, what the research shows is that sexual harassment is more prevalent in male-dominated workplaces. So one could argue, of course, that if you get more women in power, perhaps this will be less of a problem.
One thing that's happened at 21st Century Fox, which owns Fox News, it's really interesting, is an investor group recently wrote a letter to the board saying they have a shareholder meeting coming up next week, saying we will not support the current board members unless you make significant changes. Among those changes, we want you to add more female board members to the lineup of directors, because right now there's one, and she, I guess her attendance record wasn't as strong as it could have been with the meetings in the last year. And also, if you look at the top of that company too, it is a very male-dominated company, and so that's an interesting change that is trying to be put forth at Fox, but we'll see if anything happens there.
Yeah, there weren't any women on the Weinstein Company board, and those first days afterwards, after our story, as the board scrambled to kind of do damage control, one of the things that they said was that they were going to add women to the board. Well, since then, I think it was 9 board members at the time. There are now 3 board members. It's been, they resigned one after the other, and the company, the company is by many measures, sort of crumbling in the process. So there going to probably be a sale. I mean, there won't be any board at the Weinstein Company left when this is all over. But I do think that, But I do think that there are questions about how different this would look if there were more women in positions of power at companies. But it's also important to go back to something that you said just about how this is a story about abuse of power, period. And yes, we obviously are looking at a lot of male predators have come into view. But in the course of the Weinstein reporting, there were also women who came into focus as protectors of Harvey. When we were going kind of toe-to-toe with him, as we prepared to publish our story, he had by his side Lisa Bloom, who was, one of the, had sort of cultivated a reputation for being one of the big women's rights attorneys out there, who was somebody who was supposed to be out there protecting, victims. And so I think that if you kind of go more layers into this story, you're going to see women who have been complicit. And it's not just about putting any woman in a position of power.
Especially
I think it's
in HR departments. especially in corporate HR departments. They're almost always run by women, and they're set up almost exclusively to protect the executives in the company.
At Fox News, the top lawyer was a woman, and the head of the HR department was a woman. And what women at the network would say is that they feared making complaints because they thought that that would jeopardize their jobs.
Status quo.
Hi. Detractors of the reporting might say that some of these stories are fabricated, and you guys are on the front lines. I'd love to hear if that ever happens or not.
Yeah. So Bill O'Reilly has denied all the allegations that have been made against him.
Yep.
Okay, we probably have time for one more. I can't see the mic.
Hi, I'm a journalism student. I'm curious about how these investigations get started, because I'm wondering if there are leads or tips, because especially with the Weinstein story, the New York Times and the New Yorker report came out like the same week. So how that happened after 20, 30 years of allegations.
Well, so much of this has been reporting on known secrets. So Harvey Weinstein was a known secret. Everybody knew he was doing something terrible. The problems in Silicon Valley have been known secrets. So part of the reporting process has just been saying, well, what are these things everybody knows but everyone's too afraid to say? And then finding the people who will say them has been a little bit of it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in the case of the Weinstein reporting, we were following many news organizations and reporters who had attempted to do the story before and had not succeeded. And so, we would show up on the doorsteps of women who, in some cases, had spoken to other reporters who had, spoken to other news outlets, only to see the stories, get killed, and I think felt pretty, cautious as a result. And so women would say, and other sources would say directly to us, like, why should I work with you? I mean, Harvey Weinstein's going to walk into the New York Times and intimidate and bully or buy his way out of this, just as he has in all these other situations. And it was a tough situation. I mean, that's a scenario where you're saying, like, please make a leap of faith with me here. I give you my word that the New York Times is committed. I mean, please look at the work we've been doing over the past year. I think it's clear that we're committed to this subject, and we're not going to be intimidated, and we're not going to be bullied. And but I'm asking you to make a leap of faith here, and it's a tricky thing. I mean, you cannot report on a well-known. You can't. On the front page of the New York Times report, the Harvey Weinstein is a well-known, secret in Hollywood that he is engaged in predatory behavior. You've got to really piece that together through internal company documents, through, getting women on the records, through, piecing together that there have been settlements going back over years. It's tough work, and I think that there's going to just be more and more of these stories now that once you can see that it works and that we're doing it over and over again. I think it's going to make more people comfortable going on the record.
And to play off of that, and maybe this will be the last question, I do think it is significant that there are three of you here, and you are women, and you indeed worked with men on these stories. But how did that impact this process? Yeah, these have been things that have been open secrets for decades and decades. So why now?
So I want to be very clear that Mike Schmidt was my partner in all of the reporting, and we worked side by side through everything. Before we would make calls, we would be on the phone with each other, in the same room with each other before, and kind of really strategizing and talking about all of that. And I think that having the perspective of a man and a woman on the story was really valuable and really important. But I also do think that I brought maybe a different perspective because I was a young woman and I was in a position that was very similar to the women that had made these allegations against O'Reilly. And maybe people would listen to me and talk to me in a way that was different than if Mike were to give them a call.
Mm-hmm. And I worked on the SoFi story with Nathaniel, and he actually he ended up speaking with more of the women who had been in these horrible situations, and I did most of the financial legwork in that story. So I was the person who got the board emails, who found the document showing that the CEO had fabricated financial products and then sold them to investors that really he had not raised the money for, that there were all these problematic things happening in the loan business. So actually we were reversed. He was talking to a lot of women, and I was doing the sort of inside the company legwork and like working the board and working the, the financials.
I see a lot more questions. I'm getting a flashing thing here. Thank you all so much for coming.